We do not know where and when the next global pandemic will occur, but we do know that it will take a terrible toll, both on human life and the global economy. It may even cause political instability.
China says the number of people infected by a mysterious respiratory virus has more than tripled over the weekend.
A Washington state resident fell ill after returning from Wuhan, China.
Already some 24 countries on 3 continents have shuttered their schools.
We're suspending the entry of foreign nationals who have been to Europe in the last 14 days.
The number of confirmed cases has topped 1 million here in the U.S.
This is the front line in Italy's battle against the coronavirus.
The Prime Minister has been taken to hospital.
Sao Paulo, Brazil's and the Southern Hemisphere's largest city, now holds a new grim title, the epicenter of Brazil's outbreak.
Our economy simply cannot afford to be in lockdown mode anymore.
It took 90 days for Africa to reach 100,000 coronavirus infections and only 19 to pass the 200,000 mark.
This could be a record-breaking epidemic.
There's little chance of beating the coronavirus without a vaccine, but when will it be ready?
What we are wrestling with is uncertainty.
We need to act, and we need to act immediately to be able to avoid the worst.
Grim pictures indeed. Hello, everyone, and welcome to GZERO Media's live stream town hall. My name is Moki Makura, and I'm sitting here in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm going to be your host today. Thank you for joining. So today we are asking a very provocative question, and one that has no simple answers. Could our global response to COVID help end poverty, particularly in the poorest of countries? For the first time since the Great Depression, both advanced and emerging economies are in recession. Estimates from the World Bank suggest that the virus will push between 40 to 60 million people into extreme poverty this year alone. So I'm not sure.
And I'm on air. We've lost Moki. So I'm Ian Bremer, and you're stuck with me. Unfortunately, I know a little bit about what we're talking about the panel, so I'll moderate until we get Moki back, and I'll pretend to answer a question or two too. So as she was saying, my name is Ian Bremer. She wasn't quite saying that, and I'm going to be your host today. Thank you for joining. We're asking a very provocative question, and one that has no simple answers, as you saw in the video. Could our global response to coronavirus help end poverty, particularly in the poorest of countries? For the first time since the Great Depression, both advanced and emerging economies all over the world are in severe recession. Estimates from the World Bank suggest that the virus will push between 40 to 60 million people into extreme poverty this year, and the region that will be hardest hit is sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not sure who exactly said it. It was not Churchill. Never let a good crisis go to waste. I always thought that was the former mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel. At least I've heard him say it a couple times. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel about how we can turn this particular crisis into opportunity. But before that, let me tell you what to expect in the next hour. And I see Moki, but I'm not going to hand it over to her until I finish this opening, and then I'll hand it over to her. She's going to be asking the questions. We will be including some of your questions that you asked when you registered, so thank you very much for that. There have been a lot. We also encourage you all to log in to participate in our real-time polls. There are a few thousand logged in right now, and you'll see a chat window to the right of the video screen on a desktop or below the player if you're using your mobile device. You can sign in using Vimeo, Facebook, or as a guest, and once signed in, you'll see the poll window with the question and a few possible response options to choose from. Cast your vote and then keep an eye out. We're going to show the results and talk about them during the discussion. Let's get to it. And Moki, it's all yours.
You did a fantastic job. Thank you, Ian. Don't know what happened there, but that's data for you. So I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to introduce you all. Today, I'm joined by Mark Sussman, who you've seen. He's the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he's joining us from Seattle today. We've also got Vera Shongwe, who's the United Nations Under Secretary General and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. She's normally based in Addis, but is joining us from Washington, D.C. today. And last but not least, he's already spoken. You'll be hearing from Ian Bremer, who's the president of the Eurasia Group and of GZERO Media, and they're the people responsible for today's event. He's joining us from New York. So welcome, everybody. Let's really get into it now. I'd love to get your take on the COVID crisis, particularly your thoughts on the global response so far. So Mark, I'm going to start with you. We saw the opening video at the start, not a lot to celebrate. So are we winning the battle against COVID? Can you set the scene for us?
Well, thanks, Smokey, and thank you, Ian. Especially as you can see, we're a very versatile panel and each of us can step in as moderator if needed, but appreciate the opening questions. So in terms of the crisis, in the big picture, obviously, it's been pretty disappointing debate in aggregate for a couple of reasons. One is, first, this was, as you saw Dr. Tedros in that earlier video, but many other people, not least my boss, Bill Gates, but many, many others over the last 4 or 5 years have been predicting a pandemic as the most likely threat to global humanity and one that absolutely requires a joined up, well-funded, thoughtful global response. Under no circumstances would I say that is what we have seen play out over the last few months. There have been, honorable efforts and attempts. There are good models and examples of individual countries and some groups of countries. But in aggregate, we were sort of slower to advance. We were under-resourced, and it's shown and reflected a bunch of challenges back nationally and globally. But on the plus side, we are also seeing an unprecedented now lean-in response. On the scientific front, which I'm sure we'll come back to, there is a huge amount of energy around trying to get new therapeutics, which are treatments, diagnostics, and of course a vaccine, which is going to be the most critical thing to get us back to normal. That's going to take some time. It's not exactly around the corner, but we can say with some confidence, this is going to be the fastest vaccine ever developed in human history. And the tools and the cooperation we have now do make me relatively optimistic. But again, back to the thing, if we're actually going to have any of those tools help address these wider socioeconomic issues, there's going to have to be a much bigger degree of international cooperation than we've seen to date.
So thank you, Mark. We're going to have a chance to talk more about vaccines. But Ian, I'm going to come to you now. Which nations are actually getting this COVID response right?
There are, if you look at the largest two economies in the world, the United States and China, there are things you can point to that they've done well. The United States, the Fed response, the bipartisan economic response, early and large, certainly helped to reduce the scale of economic crisis and contraction that otherwise might have been experienced. Let's see if that continues. China, because they were able to take a very aggressive response to testing and quarantine, were able to really contain a virus that they were not open with their public about in the early weeks, or the international community, and get their supply chain up and running faster than anybody else. But neither of those countries are poster children for what you want to do right. What's interesting is the countries that have done things right, they're not democracies or authoritarian regimes. They're not rich countries or poor countries, but they're all countries that didn't cheerlead. They're countries that had leaders that responded in a sober and science and expertise-led, driven way early. And they tried to bring together their population and their political elites to not politicize the crisis, something that the US has had a serious problem with, China's had a serious problem with. But you can look at larger democracies like Germany and South Korea that share that and have been very effective in their responses. You look at some smaller wealthy countries like New Zealand and Singapore and Canada, they've been very effective, in Norway in those responses. You look at some poorer countries like Greece and Vietnam and Argentina, and all of those countries have also been, vastly outperforming other countries in their income bracket globally. So it's not about, oh, we've got a democracy, we're successful. Oh, you're wealthy, we're successful. It's a lot about leadership, and it's a lot about not politicizing the worst crisis that we've experienced in our lifetimes.
Right. And actually, I've got to say, a lot of the countries that are getting it right have been led by women, but that's for another discussion. Vera, let's come to you now. Africa seems to have always been positioned as the weak link in this pandemic. So just give us an idea, which of the African countries do you think have really handled this response particularly well, and why?
No, thank you. Thanks for that. I think, listen, it's surprisingly, I would say over 60% of the African countries, so I wouldn't name them given that we have over 50. But we came into it with maybe two advantages. The first one is we came in a little bit late, so we had the chance to observe the Korea experience, the China experience, the Italy experience, the French experience, and even the New York experience. So there was some sense there. But even more importantly, we came with it with a very good experience from Ebola in West Africa and the understanding that you needed an all of society, a collective action program to do it. If I were to name, and if I must name a few countries on the continent that have done it very well, I think one of the first ones will be Mauritius. Mauritius closed down almost a month before. They started testing at the airports. They put in place facilities that will work. South Africa as well. Did an amazing job, I think, in sort of almost leading the charge towards lockdowns on the continent when there was initially a lot of debate around it. Africa is losing about $55 billion on lockdowns, but I think many countries decided that, you know, we got the message that you needed to do the physical distancing, you needed to be able to isolate and track. We didn't have the resources, we didn't have the beds to do it. So countries, you know, Ethiopia, Kenya, Senegal did an amazing job of again, the West African countries from Ebola did an amazing job. North Africa and Morocco, of course, great example. But beyond physical distancing, the other thing that they did was while the rest of the world was talking about the lack of access to PPEs and things, they started looking at which industries could repurpose. And so the collective action by bringing together religious leaders, ensuring that the message on lockdown was clear, was the first part of that response. The second one was this very difficult decision initially to decide between, do we lock down or do we keep the economies open and continue to work? And then I think, you know, under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa and the African Union coming together to make those decisions. Of course, we have some African countries that didn't respond very well, and we know those ones, and the numbers, I think, are beginning to show as you know, the cases climb on the continent. Today, we have about 300,000 cases on the continent with 8,000 deaths.
So we're going to talk more about Africa sort of responding as a bloc, but I want to talk quickly about multilateral institutions because they have been at the forefront of this global response, particularly the WHO and other multilateral organizations like the UN, development banks like the World Bank. But they all have a massive role to play in leading and coordinating the response. But do they have what it takes to manage the crisis? But before I ask the panel, and I'm going to ask you about this, let's hear from the audience. So we're going to go to our first poll. So the question we're asking you in this poll is, are the current multilateral institutions capable of solving the COVID crisis? So there are three options, which you just have to vote. The first option is yes, of course. The second option is yes, with additional reform. And the third option is no, we should discontinue funding them and find new ways to work together. So please take a moment to vote and I'll come back to you with your answers. But let's hear from the panel on this. And Barry, I'm going to come straight to you because you actually work for a multilateral. So I expect your answer to the question would be, yes, of course, we're vital institutions. But let's hear from you on the broader debate around what people are saying is a long-term decline of multilateral organizations. Has this pandemic strengthened or weakened them?
I think in some cases it has strengthened them, and in some cases it has reinforced them. I don't want to look at it as weakened. I think what it has done is create larger collaborative platforms. It has forced multilateral agencies, and I talk for the UN, for example, we looking at the economic response, have been able to bring together some of the leading economists, some of the leading think tanks in the world to come together and think about how we can respond to this crisis differently. So the UN, by definition, is already a very open platform. I think we've been able to bring civil society, we've been able to bring, I think, those whose voices are normally not heard in these kinds of situations. I must congratulate the IMF. They have come out very strongly, very early in this process, but we can see that even they require a little bit more, additional resources, and we need to go back to their boards, and questions around voice and inclusion and participation, I think, begin to come to the table. And can we do more, and can we do better? Do we need the institutions? Of course, yes. WHO, I think, has been a leading light guiding us in terms of the scientific evidence. The Center for Disease Control in Africa and across the world have been particularly important institutions during this crisis. And I think what we need to do is shore them up with some resources, with more professional and technical scientific staff. But I think that there is clearly a question, at least in the financial world, on better inclusion, more representation that will maybe help us. And then, of course, additional financing for some of these institutions like the World Bank and the IMF so that they can respond in a timely manner to these crises.
So, Mark, I'm just going to come to you quickly before I give the results of the poll. But, the Gates Foundation is one of the biggest funders of WHO and of Gavi. And, clearly you've signaled in many ways that you support multilaterals. Do you agree? I mean, what do you say to the response? Do you think they're absolutely critical institutions? Should we continue the way we are? Just in a quick sentence, just tell me, what is your sort of official position on that?
Yeah, well, we're an interesting case study as a supporter of multilateral institutions, because I think I can safely say my bosses, Bill and Melinda Gates, did not start the Gates Foundation in 2000 thinking we were going to become a major supporter of multilaterals. What they discovered is, as we expanded our work in global health and development, is that multilateral institutions do play an absolutely critical role in health, in financing, in a range of other activities. And to Vera's point, I think it's, you look a little differently sector by sector. In multilaterals, in the economic sector, I think the IMF and the World Bank have both done an excellent response to date, but their resources are limited against the scale of the challenges. And so you have one set of options. In the health universe, there's a separate discussion we can have with WHO. Obviously, we've been very strong supporters. As you say, we're actually the second largest funder of the WHO after the United States. And if the United States follows through on its current plans, we might become the largest, so that we think that would be a very bad outcome. And then there are these other newer types. They're not so new anymore, but you mentioned Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the Global Fund to Fight HIV, TB, and Malaria. Those have been very specific multilateral institutions, which over the last 20 years, and we've been big partners of them, I think have had a new focus on metrics, on results, on outcomes, and had some transformative effect on healthcare in Africa and around the world. And so I think there's a lot of good, but you've got to have a slightly more nuanced discussion about which multilateral institutions for which goals, and how do you best resource them.
So the question was, are the current multilateral institutions capable of solving the COVID crisis? So the results were 11% of you said yes, of course. So Vera, you'll be happy to hear that. 81% said yes with additional reform. And 6% said, no, we should discontinue funding them and find new ways to work together. Ian, just before we go to the next section, just tell me what you would say to the 6% who said, no, we should discontinue funding them. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, look, there's a self-selection in this audience. If you're listening to this, watching this podcast, you probably care about the rest of the world in a significant way. So, look, I'm heartened by both the turnout and by how many people think these reforms are important but need to be reformed. That's what I would say. Because since these institutions were created, the geopolitical order has shifted dramatically. The United States, of course, is less committed to being the global sheriff or promoting global values, exporting democracy, even knowing exactly what that means domestically, promoting global trade. The Europeans more divided than they have been historically, though interestingly, their response to coronavirus has been pretty unified so far. And the Chinese, of course, vastly more important, but their interests, their political, their economic values and system were absolutely nowhere when we were thinking about the architecture of these institutions. So, I mean, one of the good things is you've got President Trump saying he's leaving the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic, and Mark correctly says, it'd be a disaster if that happened. But so far, it hasn't happened. It's just been an announcement. And actually, the U.S. and the WHO, as of today, are still cooperating and sharing data, and the Americans are still paying. So, I think that these institutions are more resilient than people fear, than the headlines say. But I also think that it is perfectly natural that they are less aligned with the realities and the challenges of the world today than they need to be. And if it takes a crisis of this scale to engage in serious structural reform of those institutions, to strengthen them, but also to have them reflect today's geopolitical order, I think that's a wonderful thing. That's a true opportunity. That's what I say.
Thank you. So thank you, Ian. So we're going to move on to the second section, which is we're going to talk about vaccines, which Bill Gates himself has said there will be no return to normal until there is a vaccine. And he has been scarily right about a lot of other things. So I think we should listen to him. But there are a number of vaccine trials going on right now. In fact, there's more than 100 projects, and many of them are funded in some way, I think, by Gates. But as of last month, there was something like 8 candidate vaccines being tested in clinical trials in people. South Africa started one yesterday, but a vaccine could take a year or longer, or not at all. So Mark, let's just bring you in, because Foundation has pumped over $250 million or more into vaccines and diagnostics for COVID. And I have to commend you for the speed at which the Foundation has responded to this. So just tell us a little bit about how far you are in getting a vaccine. Are we expecting anything soon?
Yes, so I mentioned earlier, I think this is the most unprecedented global response in terms of searching for a vaccine for any disease ever. That there are well over 100 different vaccine projects underway. Actually, I think the current number that are already in clinical trials is up to 11. Now, many of those just simply won't work, but we're very, very deeply engaged, both through partners like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which was actually a partnership that was set up by ourselves, the Wellcome Trust, a number of governments like Germany, the UK, Japan, Norway, in the wake of the Ebola crisis, saying there does need to be a collective response preparing for the next pandemic. And that's making a series of important investments in vaccines. We've been doing some stuff directly as well. And the short version is partly because of the nature of the coronavirus itself, which for a number of genetic and molecular reasons is probably more susceptible to a vaccine than, for example, more complex viruses like HIV, which have been with us for many decades and still resist a vaccine. And because of the technologies we have available right now, our ability to do full sort of DNA thing, modern techniques called mRNA, which is a very pioneering type of potential vaccine, which shows real promise. We feel pretty confident that even with the very likely failure of most of these in late-stage trials, which what happens, we will see a successful vaccine in the relatively near future. Relatively means at soonest, it could be as soon as the end of this year, to be honest, if regulators allow for massively accelerated parallel trials and fund them. These are expensive, so some of these also require bigger collective funding efforts. And even if these fail, we've already got a wave 2 coming behind them, which have a realistic chance of maybe coming on stream by the spring or the summer of next year, of 2021. But even producing a vaccine, there are then a number of ifs. Will it work with older people who are the most at risk? They're often less susceptible to vaccines, so you need to check that. What's going to be the cost? What kinds of distribution? Some of those new modern vaccines require to be kept at like minus 60 or 80 degrees centigrade. That's not really going to be very helpful for much of sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. Some of them are extremely expensive. So there's a lot of question about how you shift from the technology of the vaccine into the distribution. And what we really need to do is make that available for at least 5 to 6 billion people worldwide if you're going to create the kind of immunity we need. And that's a very, very big number.
Right. So let me take a viewer question now. This one is from Thea W. And Vera, I'm going to ask you this one. And the question is, when a vaccine for COVID-19 is available, what is the best approach to ensure the poor in the developed or developing countries get access to it?
I think one of the things that we're going to do is building up on this collaborative efforts that has been launched first by Africa CDC and then by the African Union to see whether we can create, and we have just launched with Strive Masiwiya and President Cyril Ramaphosa, an African procurement platform where, you know, we can probably put the vaccines. Of course, because of the technology and the difficulty of transporting vaccines, we may not be able to do that. But what is for sure is we're going to need a collaborative procurement process to do that. And I think institutions and organizations like Gavi, and congratulations for the huge lift and raise in resources recently, but also the Global Fund, hopefully that they can come together and ensure that there is a quota system that at least allows for all countries to have access to some amount of it. One of the things that the continent is talking about is, as we talk about the debt service suspensions initiatives and the additional resources that are being put into the continent, to date, we have about $40 billion of new resources or debt service suspension initiative resources that have come in. Can we secure some of those resources to immediately procure the vaccines? Because of course the question will be around, can we afford it? If we have these resources, we should be able to afford it. Then the question becomes access. And so I think working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the WHO, but more importantly, African CDC and the African Union on this platform, I think collective purchasing, scaling up the demand, leveraging our 1.2 billion people. Africa already spent 17 billion on purchasing vaccines. So we are a good market and a reliable market. And we hope that every country will be able to do that using a quota system.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vera. So let's go to our second poll about who gets the vaccine first. So there's a world population of about 7.8 billion people. So nobody's going to be able to manufacture or distribute a vaccine fast enough to meet the demand. So who should get access first? Should it be healthcare workers first, people with compromised immune systems, or people who can afford it? What do you think? Let's go to the polls. The question we are asking is, how long would you be willing to delay your access to a COVID vaccine to ensure there is an equitable rollout? The options are A, not at all, B, 0 to 6 months, C, 6 to 12 months, or D, a year or more. So please vote, and remember it's anonymous, so you can actually tell us what you really think, and we'll get to your answers in a minute. So Mark, I'm going to just ask you, because Foundation has had a really long history with vaccines, especially around your work with polio. Why are vaccine logistics so difficult? I mean, you mentioned about temperatures of minus 40 or 50, but how do we ensure a COVID vaccine, if it's ever developed, actually makes it to every corner of the globe?
Yes, well, we have a lot of experience in that, and polio is a great example. And actually, one of the lesser-known events of last week, which we should call out, is that the continent of Africa was declared formally polio-free by the World Health Organization, which is a very, very momentous occasion. It means that the only parts of the world that still have endemic polio are really Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that's huge credit, and it shows you what can be done, even in very challenging logistical environments. And in the case of polio vaccines, this requires multiple doses and multiple campaigns reaching children all over the continent in very isolated areas, and indeed all over the world. India had a very challenging thing eradicating polio and did so successfully as well. And so the world actually knows how to do it. You've mentioned the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, which is one of the true triumphs. It's probably saved more lives over the last 20 years than any collaborative effort in human history ever. And in fact, there was a successful replenishment just 3 weeks ago, hosted by Prime Minister Boris Johnson in London, which raised $8.8 billion for the next 5 years of the vaccines. And this is for existing vaccines, pneumonia, MMR vaccines, et cetera, that really are the biggest and cheapest lifesavers we have. So I'm actually relatively optimistic on that. It was challenging, but we know how to do this. We have the constructs, we have the supply chains, we have the health systems. What you don't have is the money and the resources able to procure at scale in sufficient volumes, back to those points that you have about, and what is an equitable distribution, and how do you do this collaboratively at a time so many individual countries are just trying to lock up supply for their own citizens, which is an understandable impulse. Governments are required to look after the needs of their own citizens first, but there's the risk that that kind of vaccine nationalism actually sets the world back.
Thank you, Mark. Ian, I'm going to ask you this. So I guess we need to think about the fact that there could be a scenario where there is no vaccine at all. So can you just talk us through what the world would look like if there is no vaccine? Because that's been the thing we've been looking towards, like there's a vaccine coming. What if there isn't?
Well, I mean, I take great solace in the fact that the people that know this issue far better than I do across the board have been very optimistic. But that doesn't mean that we're going to have one in 6 months or in 12 months, and doesn't mean the world is going to have one in 1.5 years or 2 years. As you've said, the distribution is a problem. So what I would say is the longer that big parts of the world have to go without an effective vaccine, and when we say effective vaccine, it's not just about distribution, but it's also about education to get people to actually take it. And there's a problem, not just in the developing world to get it to people, but in countries like the US and France, where the anti-vaxxer movements are actually quite significant and growing. I would worry that this is going to be, it's going to enhance inequality very significantly, and policy responses need to understand that. So in the United States, the longer we go without a vaccine, if you're in the knowledge economy, you're doing relatively okay. You have the ability to socially distance, you can still make money, you still have a job. The farther you are from the knowledge economy, the worse it is for you. So the working class and the middle class gets much more hollowed out. They need a lot more support. In the developing countries, you not only have that problem of an emerging middle class that suddenly is a big swathe of global labor that is no longer as relevant to capital and are getting disintermediated, they're being thrown out of work, but you also don't have the international travel. So all of those countries that rely on tourism or remittances from their citizens leaving their countries, making more money in advanced industrial economies and sending it back, it's gone. And so I think we have to understand that the support base for the people that most need it is going to get eroded much more dramatically. That will accelerate much more as long as the vaccine is not available. And the policy responses must reflect that.
It sounds like there's got to be a vaccine option. But anyway, let's hear what kind of people we have in the audience. Remember, we asked you how long you'd be willing to delay your access to a vaccine. And the results are just coming in. So 5% of you said you are not prepared to wait at all. 33% of you said you're prepared to wait between 0 to 6 months. 37% of you said between 6 to 12 months, and 23% of you said you are prepared to wait a year or more. So, great audience, thank you. A couple of words for the people, the 5% in there that are not prepared to wait at all. But we've been talking about vaccines, and by their very nature, their development is very high risk, they're expensive, and as Mark has explained, they are tricky to distribute. But what about treatment? We now know that hydrochloroquine doesn't work. Somebody should probably tell the US that, but this newly discovered old drug, dexamethasone, does. WHO have called for an increase in its production. Mark, treatment is a cheaper alternative to a vaccine. Can we and should we prioritize treatment over prevention?
Well, I don't think as you prioritize one over the other. We do all at the same time. So in addition to the vaccine work you talked about, we actually launched, again with the Wellcome Trust, which is this great UK-based medical charity who helped us with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. We launched something called the Therapeutics Accelerator in February, where we were putting hundreds of millions into testing existing products. You can take, and you can do this with hospitals, if things that have already been tested for safety and efficacy, meaning they don't have to go through all that regulatory that could be useful against COVID. And so that's been underway. That's actually this test that came up with this new product, which is a generic steroid that's relatively true, that we're trying to do to literally thousands of existing drugs. And one of the good news, which is not often recognized, is the pharmaceutical industry has been responding. We actually, through that Therapeutics Accelerator, set up something we call the Pandemic Reframe Library, which is asking pharmaceutical companies, would they be willing to just share some of their proprietary compound lists for us to run through and process and see whether we get hits. And again, not all of them, but we've had nearly 10 big global pharmaceutical companies willing to do this. So I think this is a sign that there is critical global collaboration. We're hoping we will find more of those kinds of tools and treatments which are relatively low cost, relatively easily available, and do act as prevention. There's some higher tech ones, a bit like those complicated vaccines, so-called antibodies, basically MABs, they're called neutralizing antibodies, which could be effective as well. They're slightly more challenging technically, but could be done in some combinations. So yes, treatment is critical, particularly for keeping the economy going, keeping people able to work and engage. It's not a substitute for a vaccine, but it's a critical part of the solution.
All right, thank you, Mark. So let's go to the question that frames this event. Can our response to the pandemic actually help eradicate poverty. So Mark, I'm going to start with you again, because the foundation is notorious for being eternally optimistic. And this really is the million-dollar question. How can we turn this crisis into an opportunity when the situation actually seems so dire?
Well, I'd say it's a multi-trillion-dollar question rather than a million-dollar question at the moment, if you look at the what's already happening with the global economy. And the reason we're optimistic is, even if that's been slower, and I started being on the slightly gloomy side, that there is no substitute in the long term for a more global cooperative response to this. And going back to right where we started, could this help tackle wider challenges of global poverty, etc.? I think there is still a very real opportunity as countries go through this first phase and realize the challenges of sort of slightly more short-sighted nationalist responses, and that we really do need to have some bigger, more global cooperative efforts, especially in healthcare, looking for the next pandemic crisis. What are we going to do about surveillance in not just Africa and Asia, but everywhere, to map the next product? There are lots of really good opportunities for new cooperative frameworks. There are potential opportunities to radically accelerate some other interventions. Digital learning at the moment is a little bit of a disaster with all these kids home from school all over the world. But it allows us a potential leapfrog opportunity, which could create massive educational opportunities, especially in the developing world in South Asia, Latin America, Africa, etc. So that's where we remain optimistic. I think there's no doubt we're in for some short-term pain, but if we can learn the right lessons, there's some real opportunities for some stronger, longer-term economic cooperation, well beyond health, into economic cooperation, education, and a number of other sectors.
All right, thank you, Mark. And Vera, let's bring you in on this, because governments, particularly on the continent, have competing priorities, and health and all of these things, education, they all take a back seat sometimes. So someone like Nigeria, for example, they propose to cut their budget by into primary health by 40% because of the decline in oil revenues, and lots of other countries are suffering. So you recently convened a meeting of the African finance ministers, and I assume it was to talk about the impact of COVID. What was the overriding sentiment? What do African finance ministers want or think will help them?
Three things. The first one, I think, is that African finance ministers in this crisis, a very strong and solid message that is coming out is the realization that Africa was, or a lot of Africa, 70% of Africa was growing sustainably, and African finance ministers were pursuing, I think, the right macroeconomic policies. So they didn't do anything wrong. And so this is not an event where we start talking about, the whole of Africa is going to collapse. And I think we have seen that actually, everybody, if you look at the markets in March, Africa's spreads were 1,000 basis points, because I think everybody thought that will unravel. What African finance ministers are looking for is some sense of an immediate relief. Africa does not have the kind of liquidity central banks that can put, injections today. We have about $10 trillion that has been injected into G20 economies. We don't have a similar kind of economic base for that. Hence, the call for not debt cancellation, but a debt service suspension. And I think that this distinction is sometimes getting lost on many people. The reason why the African finance ministers called for a debt service suspension was because they believe that they can make good on their promises. They just needed time to understand the magnitudes of the crisis. Now, if you take a case like Nigeria, it's an extreme case because, we all woke up one morning and found oil prices at negative numbers. 90% of Nigeria's revenue comes from oil prices. So I don't think it was just the health spend that took a hit. It has to be everything took a hit in Nigeria, as in Angola, as in Algeria, as in Equatorial Guinea, which are huge oil exporting countries. But I think three things. African finance ministers have come together. Just like the rest of the world, they have actually taken the right policy measures to shore up their SMEs, because they know that those SMEs will be needed in the Build Back Better. So countries like Egypt have given tax holidays, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal have all given tax holidays to the SME sector. They have actually provided relief on energy costing in Kenya and transferring. I think Ian talked about remittances. The cost of intra-continental and intra-country remittances has been brought down to zero. So there's a lot has been done by the African finance ministers in this, but a little bit more needs to now be done by the international community. Exactly as I said, we don't have central banks. We cannot inject the kind of capital into our economies, developed economies are doing. So we hope that we can use things like the special drawing rights from the IMF, to provide some more liquidity for our private sector, for our banking colleagues. And as well, we have also been suggesting a special purpose vehicle to be able to see how we finance the Build Back Better processes, which are in a more sustainable way as Africa comes out of this crisis. So I think very important message that we want to leave is Finance Minister said, we are not in a solvency crisis, we're just in a liquidity crisis, and we're in a gap forward.
Okay, so well, that's a great segue to our next poll, which is about debt relief. So the question we're asking now is, should low and middle income countries be entitled to debt relief? The options are A, yes, with no conditions, B, yes, with conditions attached, or C, no, not at all. So please take a moment to cast your vote. And Ian, I'm going to come to you now to just ask a little bit about debt relief. It seems like a get out of jail card for poor countries, but what are some of the pros and cons? Is it really that straightforward?
Well, I mean, it's straightforward in the sense that they can't pay. I mean, the money's not there. So, I mean, you look at a country like Argentina right now, you look at Lebanon right now, you look at Ecuador right now. I mean, if you're not restructuring, if you're not providing debt relief, they're just going to default. So the question is, what are the conditions that you come to some form of agreement? And some of that is a haircut, and some of that is extending the way they pay. But the reality is that any such negotiation means that there is some level of debt relief coming out. And the only question is what the percentage is. Look, I know the IMF is talking right now, for example, about reallocating special drawing rights from a lot of the middle income emerging markets to the poorest countries that most need it, that need the emergency financing. I think that's a great idea, especially because right now, with interest rates very low, the middle income countries have been able to go to market for additional debt, and these poorest countries really can't. I mean, the negative side of debt relief is always moral hazard. Well, if you just give it to them, they're going to be, sort of even less responsible going forward. The fact is that these countries are not in the driver's seat. And we only have to look back in the way that the Germans and the Europeans made sure that their bankers were bailed out, and the pain was on the back of the Greeks, who they thought were shiftless and lazy. In reality, were the ones that were suffering the most all the way through. In this environment where global inequality is growing, where climate change is going to hit the poorest, the worst, and where the wealthy countries have already been the ones that have been emitting for generations, you have to change the equation by which you think about those irresponsible poor countries that are loaded up with debt. A greater degree of willingness to think of the whole world as a common planet, as global humanity really matters. And my final point on this is there is an opportunity here. The opportunity is, if it's not vaccine nationalism, if the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization and the UN and the EU are winners coming out of this, so that we can see that in less than 4 years, fastest the world ever created a vaccine before was 4 years and months. If we end up doing this in a year and a half, and it's a global response, you can create a greatest generation that actually thinks of the planet in a holistic way. And globalism doesn't become a dirty word about only the 0.1% that jet off to different cities and don't care about the rest of the people in their own countries. Instead, it's about how the planet came together to save itself from this horrible disease. And Lord knows we need that lesson, given the bigger challenges, the bigger global challenges that are coming over the coming years.
Right. No, thank you for that, Ian. I completely agree. But let's go to a viewer question. And this one is from Sarah B. And Mark, I'm going to throw this one at you because we know the foundation is heavily focused on gender, and it's a gender question. So Sarah asks, ending poverty can only be achieved by addressing inequality, especially gender inequality. So what ideas do you have for responding to COVID to help improve gender equality? And what kind of gender data do we need in order to do that?
Yeah, so absolutely, the short term, although currently it does actually look as if mortality rates for men are higher COVID than for women for a number of reasons. Some of that is a testing artifact, but some of that seems to be genuine. And one of the interesting therapeutic preventions is whether testosterone suppression may actually help get better outcomes. But more broadly, there's a much bigger challenge, and we at the Gates Foundation have been funding heavily into how you get better gender disaggregated data across all of these aspects, not just health outcomes, but access to financial services, access to property rights, access to wider educational and employment opportunities, etc. Because you simply cannot tackle both immediate health responses, especially given the fact that 70 to 80% of health workers are women, and more broadly economic opportunities, which I'm sure Vera can be very eloquent about, unless you are specifically targeting and tackling women. I mean, just take one example: the agricultural sector, which is the largest economic sector in Africa and still large parts of South Asia, is predominantly actually farmed by women. But we know that women have access to less credit, they're less likely to have title, they have less time available to farm because of family duties, they're less likely to get extension services. There's a whole run of things stacked against them. And so you need the data and the policy interventions that are going to tackle that if you're going to then unlock the kind of entrepreneurialism that will drive to a different set of outcomes. So very much, again, both the COVID response and the wider economic response, you need a clear, explicit focus on gender, and data is the starting point.
Great, thank you, Mark. So let's actually take the results of the poll. So remember, we asked you this question: should low and middle income countries be entitled to debt relief? The response was, this is real time, 28% of you said yes with no conditions, 71% of you said yes with conditions attached, and none of you said no. Amazing. So it's great to see that everybody seems to be behind some kind of debt relief. So, Ian, just give me your reactions to that. I mean, is this the way to go then?
Yeah, the question is always the conditionality. I mean, historically, the United States and the advanced industrial economies, when they extend debt and also when they provide debt relief, the conditionality is usually about reforms that Western economists believe will create more sustainable growth over time for society. Now, they've been criticized that a lot of this can be quite austere and can cause enormous hardship for the populations that you don't really want to hurt. On the other hand, it tends to be attached to political liberties and political reforms. Now, China's going to be the world's largest economy in all likelihood in the next 10 years. They're going to be critical to the debt relief equation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where I think China's responsible for 80% of all external bilateral debt that the sub-Saharan Africans have outstanding. The Chinese are not going to be looking for economic liberalization or political liberalization as part of the conditionality. Frequently, it's much more opaque, sometimes with terms that might make these countries much more politically and economically in hock to the national interests of China over the long term, that may not be in the interest of the world, or certainly these countries and their populations. So I think we have to worry that as the global order is fragmenting somewhat, and certainly as the US and China are in much greater loggerheads against each other, the potential that we're going to be fighting over conditionality and debt for some of the countries that are least capable of pushing their own agendas for their own people is going to be something we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to.
Okay, great, Ian. So we're coming to nearly the end. We've actually only got 5 minutes left of this town hall. So I'd love to use this remaining time to hear one last thought from each of you about the key or trillion-dollar question that Mark called it, about how COVID can contribute to ending poverty, and what are the key next steps for countries. And I'm going to start with Vera, you.
Well, thank you. I think one thing that COVID has shown us, and I think Ian alluded to it, or Mark, has been the use of technology. And it has shown us that, if Africa can expand and deepen the use of technology, we can actually contribute much, much faster to lowering poverty. Today, we have about 30 million people that are in the informal sector on the continent, for whom we have no access to because we don't know where they are. I think with technology and the Economic Commission for Africa, we just launched an app working again with all the 5 largest telcos on the continent to identify all this. If there's one thing that African leaders should do when they come out of this crisis, is build, deepen access and bandwidth for technology. And I think the answer to the other question about the 70% who said yes with conditions, Ian, you're spot on. They want to know, they want to have more information on the use of those resources, not so much conditionality. And telecommunications and more information will give us that.
Ian, let's hear from you.
I want to actually lean into what Vera was just saying. I mean, you look at a couple 100 million people in Nigeria, over 100 million in Ethiopia, and how few of them are taking advantage of real-time data for agricultural growth, for crops, for healthcare. I mean, how fast telemedicine is moving, for example, right now, and will accelerate on the back of coronavirus. This is an enormous opportunity for the poorest countries in the world. If this crisis, instead of being a pandemic, if it was a cyber attack that brought down digital capabilities, had the same economic impact, let's say 10% global contraction of the economy, but it made the digital companies the ones that you couldn't trust, your virtual identity, and instead it was the bricks and mortar companies that were doing the best, I would be much more pessimistic about our future, because that would be putting all of the money in the companies' pockets that are most oriented towards the 20th century. Instead, I mean, there's enormous dislocation coming globally, but the companies that are actually doing the best are the ones that are most oriented towards 21st century solutions. And if they handle that correctly, and if we regulate them correctly, if we work together, that's an incredible opportunity for humanity, and particularly for the poorest populations in the world.
Great, thank you, Ian. Let's hear from you, Mark.
Yes, so before coronavirus hit, we were in a relatively optimistic space for a lot of these issues. And I want to just build on what both Vera and Ian said in terms of the technology potential contribution to a different kind of futures. Vera was actually a member of a panel co-chaired by Melinda Gates and Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Indonesian finance minister, and Strive Masayiwa, the African billionaire, looking at how technology could actually be a transformative tool for good. Amidst all the doom and gloom that robots are going to take your jobs in the future, etc., it's often lost how there are so many things in the financial services sector, in the education sector, and others, digital healthcare, where this can be truly transformative in a sort of democratic, equitable way that's really helping the very poorest. And that was also a similar theme in a panel that was convened by the Secretary General, the United Nations Secretary General Guterres, that was co-chaired by Jack Ma of China and Melinda Gates, my boss of the United States. And it's not a coincidence, it was a China and US philanthropist chairing it, which was on high-level digital cooperation, which also laid out a wide series of areas where there is room for unprecedented cooperation, which would very much lift all boats and put us on a different trajectory. So while we're in the midst of the day-to-day fight against coronavirus, we often lose sight of the fact that we do have potential unprecedented tools to tackle these global challenges of today and tomorrow, including wider ones like climate and related issues.
Thank you, Mark. And it's due to an unprecedented tool we're actually able to have this session, because we're all in different places. But that's actually all we have time for. So let me thank my panelists for their time and their ideas. Let's hope you leave this session feeling a little bit more optimistic about the world's future during these trying times. So thank you, Mark Sisman. Thank you, Ian Bremmer, and thank you, Vera Shongwe, and thank you to everybody who's watching. And if you do want to know more about what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is up to, you can subscribe to The Optimist to receive stories, research, and news directly to your inbox. Follow the link on your screen right now. My name is Moki Makura, and this has been a GZERO Media special event. From all of us, take care.